Do Australia's new encryption interception laws put everyone's safety and privacy at risk?
And do they damage Australia's international IT reputation?
Vertical Hold, Behind the Tech News, is proudly brought to you by Belkin.
Welcome to Vertical Hold, Behind the Tech News, where we talk to Australia's leading technology journalists to get the stories behind the news for the week. I'm Alex Kidman, and I'm joined by a man who still thinks that password 1 is a strong password, Adam Turner, as we go behind the headlines in search of the big picture.
Come on, no one's ever going to guess that.
We're also joined by the editor of the Risky Business podcast, which is not an all Tom Cruise appreciation podcast, but instead an award-winning security podcast, Patrick Gray. Pat, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
This week, we're looking at changes to Australia's encryption interception laws. But first, over to the Vertical Hold news desk. Adam, what's new in tech?
The 10 all-access streaming service has finally opened its doors in Australia, supporting PC, Mac, Chromecast, Apple TV and mobile devices. After a 1-month free trial, 10 is asking for $9.95 a month, which seems a bit steep considering there's not much in the way of new and interesting content. We're mostly talking about a back catalogue of 10's free-to-air programming, along with classics from the CBS archives and a few originals, but not Star Trek Discovery. One upside is that some CBS shows from the US are fast-tracked to stream on the same day, even before they appear on Channel 10 in Australia itself.
The federal government's 2018 Regional Telecommunications Review has recommended that NBN Co adopt a co-investment strategy for its controversial Technology Choices NBN upgrade program. Under the current program, if you want to upgrade your NBN connection from its current state to a better technology, you've got to pay a quote fee and then all of the costs of deployment, often in the tens of thousands of dollars or higher. The review suggests that this is a significant break to upgrading NBN technologies in regional areas, and that NBN Co should start bearing some of that upgrade cost burden.
TPG faces court action, with the ACCC alleging that the telco misled customers over a $20 prepayment in the terms of its contracts. The issue dates back to 2013, with the consumer watchdog estimating that TPG likely pocketed millions of dollars in forfeited prepayments. Now, TPG describes the charge as a prepayment to cover costs not included in their plan, such as overseas phone calls. But the money was treated more like a non-refundable fee, with TPG automatically topping up balances and retaining at least half of that money when customers cancelled their plan.
According to rumours, Microsoft might finally be waving the white flag in the browser wars. Microsoft's Edge browser hasn't exactly set the world on fire, or, for that matter, recaptured the dominant position it had back in its Internet Explorer days, but it's reportedly set to ditch Edge in favour of a Chromium-based browser codenamed Anaheim. Microsoft may, in fact, still opt to call the new browser Edge, but it'll be using the same core rendering engine as Chrome and should essentially behave in the same way.
So, Alex, is anyone going to be sorry to see the back of Microsoft Edge?
Well, I guess there's probably some Microsoft programmers who might be polishing up their CVs. If this rumour bears out, and it is still only at rumour stage, it's a really interesting journey for Microsoft to have been on because, I mean, you and I have been writing about this stuff since the time when, Microsoft was at war with the US Department of Justice over bundling an internet browser, which it saw as a vital business step to come to a point where it basically has to say, yeah, okay, Chrome kind of won is really interesting. Although I'm not 100% convinced that having an all Chrome world, and okay, yes, Safari exists, and there are a few people out there who use things like Opera, for example. But basically, if this comes to pass, Chrome, will be utterly ascendant. I'm not entirely sure that's a really great step across a bunch of fronts. Pat, you're a security guy. Is there a risk in having Chrome as the entry point for the web for everyone?
I don't know about that, really. I guess that's the whole monoculture discussion, isn't it? This is like the same stuff that Dan Geer, a very well-known guy in information security, warned us about in the early 2000s with regard to just plain old Windows computers. But I wouldn't think that, rebadging Chrome and, they they will be making changes to it. But, using that rendering engine, I think it's the best one we've got. So I think it's probably a net win.
Part of the problem, though, is that Chrome has got a bit lazy. It's that bloated resource hog and it's power hungry. It's the reason it's got the problems that we tried to get away from. We moved away from Internet Explorer to Firefox because it was lean. And then we moved away from Firefox to Chrome because it was lean. When everybody's using the same engine underneath, is there still going to be that pressure to try and actually come up with something that's not a resource pig?
Yeah, well, I don't know. I don't know. The browser wars, as far as I can tell, it feels like the browser wars kind of petered out a while ago, right? Like, people don't tend to care as much about the browser they run on their machines because they just want something that works. And now computers are spec'd sufficiently that, pretty much any browser is going to get the job done. So, yeah, I get what you're saying, though, about the pressure to innovate.
Yeah, I guess there is still competition out there. You do have, as I said before, Opera. You do have Firefox, of course. And actually, for anyone who hasn't played with the more recent versions of Firefox, they've picked up their game a bit. They're a bit snappy, and maybe that is a too little, too late kind of discussion. But there are still options out there. I guess the other really interesting thing, though, is that it does mean that we will be looking at everything but Macs having a Chrome-based browser pre-installed, and people are essentially kind of lazy. They just stick with what's there. And I suspect that's a pretty big part of Edge's market share as it is.
So if you've been following anything to do with tech in the news recently, you will have been following the Assistance and Access Bill, which is a fancy name for saying the way to let people sort of peek at what you're doing when you thought it was maybe encrypted and no one else could see it. Now, Pat, as we record this, the government's pulled 173 amendments out and gone, here, just shove this through Parliament. It looks like it's going to get through. What does it all mean? Should we be concerned?
Oh, I think we should always be concerned when the government wants to give itself any new power involving surveillance, and especially, doubly so when one of the major parties is saying that it's a problematic bill, and some of the minor parties are just, running around freaking out about it. So, yeah, I do think we should be concerned, but I think perhaps people are freaking out a little bit too hard on this one because I think there's a bit of a disconnect between what the bill may allow and what agencies that are seeking these powers actually want to do with it. And it all comes down to the problem of trying to define certain technical concepts in a piece of legislation. So in particular, the biggest problem with this bill is it would allow agencies that have obtained a warrant already. So that's, the police might be investigating a murder. They go and they get a warrant to, either search someone's device or to intercept their messages under an interception warrant. But then they realize, hey, we don't actually have a technical capability to say, look at this person's WhatsApp messages because, if we intercept those messages on the wire, they're all encrypted end to end. There's not really a practical way for us to get in the middle of that communication. So we will need some form of assistance from the provider to make to enable that warrant. If that
when you say
sense.
The provider, do you mean the provider of their phone or the provider of like the WhatsApp, the provider?
Doesn't matter. Anyone who can help,
anybody,
right?
Anybody who can help, yeah.
That's the point, right? So you might be after some WhatsApp messages, but I tell you right now, if it's WhatsApp on iPhone, Apple could probably help you get on the device, right? Yeah. If it's, Signal on Android, maybe Google can help. And that's kind of the idea here. So the idea is not to introduce things like key escrow schemes or, break security as we know it. The bill says they can ask for, reasonable and proportionate assistance from technology companies, including issuing these things called technical capability notices, where they can say, we want you to do a thing so that we can do this. And, it needs to be reasonable and proportionate and must not introduce a systemic weakness. The problem is when you actually try to sit down and define what a systemic weakness is and what reasonable and proportionate looks like, the whole thing falls over. And that's why people are so concerned. And I think those concerns are certainly valid, right? But it's not like this is an easy thing to fix, right? Like it's not like an easy thing to define. I've been working on covering information security and communicating security concepts for 17 years. And if you asked me to sit down and try to work through some principles for what reasonable and proportionate and systemic weakness mean, come back in 3 years and I might have something for you.
Yeah. So just to clarify,
I'm still left kind of scratching my head, though, as to how you enforce this as well. And I agree with you that it is complex, but if I'm and WhatsApp maybe isn't the best example because they're big and they're already kind of established. But if I come up with WhatsApp 2, the new version of it, and I'm based out of Belgium, and the Australian government comes knocking and says, "Oh, look, by the way, we need to look at this stuff." What can the Australian government actually do to me? I mean,
they can go to Apple. Or they can go to the carrier who might be running, if the person bought their phone domestically, they might be running some over-the-air carrier management software on their phone.
Sure,
right?
For sure.
So,
but what if the way that I have encrypted or the way that this is running means that they can't help, but I potentially could? In what I don't get.
Well,
then
they're out of luck, right?
Yeah.
So they're not expecting this, and this is what I mean when I say that people are kind of. I don't know. I just see people attacking this thing from some of the wrong angles, right? Like, okay, look, if you're using a phone and using a computer that's offline to manually PGP encrypt messages that you're then typing into the phone, well, the bill's not going to apply. But no criminal in the world is going to implement a system like that. Currently...
Well, they are now that you've mentioned it.
Thanks for that idea. Yeah.
Currently, the Mexican cartels are heavily involved in the distribution and smuggling of fentanyl into the United States. According to a piece I read in the New York Times some months ago, the standard operating procedure when, say, the Sinaloa cartel sends people into the United States, their standard operating procedure is to give those operatives a mobile phone, an iPhone, with signal on it. So this is the thing. We're into this really weird situation where OPSEC has become very easy for organised crime syndicates, terrorist syndicates, using commercial off-the-shelf software. So one criticism I've heard of the bill is, if this goes through, people will stop using those mainstream technologies. Like, that's a bad thing. That's exactly what we want. Every time someone starts a business designing some sort of secure messaging application and markets it towards criminal syndicates, the FBI eventually rip the thing to shreds and it rains indictments, right? So denying the use of this technology is kind of part of it, right?
Can I just clarify one thing at this point, that what they're talking about doing is they don't actually want to put a weakness in encryption itself. They don't want to crack the encryption. So to use the example, Alex and I are sending messages to each other on our phone, and we'll say an encrypted stream going between us. Am I right in thinking they don't want the ability to crack open that encrypted stream, to break the encryption and to see what's inside? Instead, what they want to do is peek at what goes in and out of that encrypted link on each end. So they want to sneak onto my phone or sneak onto Alex's phone so they can see the message before it's encrypted or after it's de-encrypted. But not everybody gets that, does they?
No, they don't.
But some people think that they actually, what the government's asking them to do is build a weakness into encryption itself. Isn't the language
sufficiently broad that it could be either? I mean, wasn't that what you were saying before, Pat?
And this is the issue, right? Is the language kind of has to be broad, because if they make this thing prescriptive, right, once you start getting into defining engineering scenarios in legislation, would you want the Australian government making those sorts of decisions, or would you want them to instead, give themselves the power to ask the technology companies how, to come to them and ask them for a capability and let them determine how to best deliver the capability, right? So there are good reasons for it being vague, but they don't exactly reassure people. And the whole thing is like, we don't even know, first of all, what types of requests authorities are going to pass on to the tech companies, and we don't know what the response of the tech companies is going to be. But fundamentally, and this is the thing, okay, will the passage of this bill possibly introduce some risks to consumer security? Yes, right? Absolutely. Anytime you're building any form of interception capability, there is a risk that it can be abused. I don't know how big that risk is, but we also need to weigh that risk against the risk of not doing anything and having a fairly absurd situation, and it is uncharted territory, where people can have conversations that are completely impervious to law enforcement and some intelligence agencies.
And I guess, look, that perhaps comes down to where one sits on the kind of privacy versus security spectrum, because that is a kind of weighting mechanism. I guess my concern comes from looking at, for example, what happened with the government's existing metadata legislation, which was very much phrased and framed the same way. Oh, we want to use this for criminal activity. We want to use this to stop terrorists and child abuse. And that is a very, very noble aim. I'm certainly not suggesting they should not chase those kinds of abhorrent things. But as we've seen with that, there have been an awful lot of other uses. I mean, the quantity of metadata requests and the weird places that have requested them is it's jaw-dropping.
The Taxi Commission, because they might be investigating non-payment of fares or something. Metadata stuff does tend to pop up everywhere. I mean, but again, I think the government did a really terrible job of selling that bill. It could have been a much easier sell if they had have just explained a few things. And I think the first thing they should have explained is that metadata was disappearing because telcos didn't need to keep it for billing purposes anymore. And I think they needed to explain just how vital metadata is in the early stages of investigations for including and excluding people from investigations into crimes. It is just such a first step tool that to lose access to that would have been really bad. And the regime we wound up with is very similar to what is in place in other countries. So it's very similar to what's in place in the United States. After Snowden, disclosed those documents in 2013 that revealed that NSA was hoovering up all of this metadata and keeping it in a government database. That was the most controversial thing that he disclosed. That program was ended, and they wound up moving to something very similar to what we have here in Australia when it comes to metadata retention. This is a pretty different kettle of fish, though, because we're dealing with content, right? So metadata does not require a warrant. Content does. So this bill does absolutely nothing to alter the circumstances under which police or security agencies can actually view content. They still need to apply for a warrant the same way they did previously. This is just about the technical capability to actually use that warrant. And I think that's another thing that hasn't really been made clear here is this is not and calling it the Assistance and Access Bill was a bad move, because access implies that this is somehow a bill that would allow ASIO to read everyone's stuff. That it's a loosening of oversight, and it's not. It's just not.
So how does this compare to what's happening in other countries? Because you said how metadata, maybe our laws are kind of in line with what you see in other countries. Is any other country doing what we're talking about doing with this access bill?
The UK, this is basically a cut and paste of the UK Investigatory Powers Bill, Investigative IP Bill. There you go. I can't say Investigatory Powers Bill a few times very quickly, but it's very, very
dead
similar
and bloodied
to that
along
law.
the way.
But look, I mean, I've spoken to, people who work in fairly senior positions in Silicon Valley companies who said that at least when I spoke to them last about it, they said they hadn't come up against that one yet, and they didn't know how robust that bill was in terms of whether or not they would be able to use it as a stick to get them to do things that they didn't want to do. But it's hard to know because it's all shrouded in secrecy, isn't it?
So what kind of feedback was there in the UK when they passed this? Was there the same sort of reaction that there has been here?
Very controversial. Yeah, it was. In fact, more so than it was here.
Is it? I mean, I can't help but think of the situation, and this is going back only just a couple of years, where Apple refused to unlock iPhones for the US government. I think it was San Bernardino shooter, if I remember correctly.
Yep, you got it.
And they basically gave the US government the middle finger, and they kind of went and found another way, essentially speaking. This is a bit more kind of compelling than that, but it seems more likely that it'll hit an Apple or a Google because they've got Australian offices than it will. Well, actually, I honestly don't know if WhatsApp has an Australian office. I don't think they do.
Well, Facebook does, and Facebook owns WhatsApp. So
I suppose fair call. But given the kind of vague enforceability of this, because I could see a Facebook, for example, just saying, but that's WhatsApp and they're incorporated in wherever they're incorporated, and you'll have to talk to them. Yeah, probably Liechtenstein or the Bahamas. You'll have to talk to their corporate office. Given that the enforceability of this is shaky, is this a real bill, or is this saber rattling for the sake of election promises?
No, it's a real bill, and there's a real synchronization going on right now in terms of policy direction from the UK, Australia, Canada, the United States, and New Zealand. There was a 5-country ministerial meeting on the Gold Coast a few months back, and they issued a joint communique. And this is not Five Eyes, as in the intelligence agencies. This is like a meeting of attorneys general and public safety agency ministers from those 5 countries. So they all had a big powwow, and then they issued a joint communique outlining their principles when it comes to this topic. And it seems like everyone's on the same page. So, okay, we might say we're Australia, who are we to do this? But, well, the UK's got it as well. Canada will. New Zealand will. The one question mark, and what will really determine how this goes, is what happens in the States, and whether or not we wind up. So I don't know if you're familiar with the Cloud Act, but the Cloud Act is a recently passed law in the United States that allows certain countries to directly request evidence from companies in the United States. So the way it worked previously is most of the time if an Australian court issued warrant was seeking evidence that was, held by some US company, the warrant would have to go to Australia's Attorney General, then to the US Attorney General, to the FBI, to the company, and then back again. And that process would take between 18 and 24 months. So that was based on a piece of law written in 1986. It was a Mutual Assistance in Criminal Matters Act. So it wasn't working, right? So MLAT reform has been a big topic in this, this broader debate. And the Cloud Act passed. So what that means is when we get on the list of countries that are covered by the Cloud Act, it means that a warrant from, say, an Australian Magistrates Court can be directly served to a US company, and they are allowed to then turn over that data and they can bypass the MLAT process. My point being that I think we could see something similar for these types of capabilities. So the US might say, if it does pass laws like these, and I'm not sure that it will, I think that's still a really open question at this point, but say they do, they might start saying, well, US tech companies are covered by US law and they can only assist these countries because they match these criteria, which might be around human rights and, the quality of the courts and the quality of the laws and things like that. That said, it is also my fear that this capability will be doled out much like weapons sales are, and very much divvied up along strategic lines rather than by rules according to human rights and quality of laws and governance. But it is this is a massive topic at the moment. There are many, many moving parts to it. And we were always going to wind up with a bill like this. I don't know that we've got a great result. Labor's saying they're going to keep working on it into 2019 and there'll be further amendments. I hope that's true. But look, this is just the world we're living in, where governments have said it is not acceptable. Our primary responsibility is to protect our citizens, and we feel that obligation is being threatened by this technology, and we're trying to do something about it. So, it's got a way to play out yet. Let's just put it that way.
So going back to what you were saying earlier about Snowden and the NSA, now tell me if I'm remembering this correctly, but when the big providers such as Google and others realized that the NSA had infiltrated their systems and were reading data, they all introduced a big push for end-to-end encryption to protect their end users' privacy, because they knew that the likes of the NSA were getting into their systems. So if that's the case, I'm wondering if they might also start to introduce countermeasures now in the way their systems work to try and counteract the kind of rules that Australia's introducing.
Yeah, I think they will. And I wrote as much, I think, back in 2013. I wrote an opinion piece for Wired that predicted the E2E stuff, right? And that, say iMessage, they might start to introduce more granular, key warnings, which would prohibit governments from being able to do some of the things that they're already saying they want to do, like being added to conversations much in the way as an extra device, much in the same way that if you're using iMessage on your iPhone, you can also use it on your iPad. And maybe, the police, when investigating serious crimes, would quite like to be added as an extra device as well, and they would like the Apple to suppress the warning that a new device has been added to the conversation. So I think that I think that it's entirely possible that tech companies will start introducing countermeasures, and we could see the laws start to ratchet up a bit. Ultimately, the place that we really have to go with this is some sort of compromise, because we can't have the government determining technology features and we can't have technology companies determining government policy. These two things are just so in conflict at the moment, and an absolute victory on either side would be bad, in my view.
From an Australian perspective, I'm curious because I've seen the argument that one of the problems with this act passing is if you work in an IT export sector, if you're selling Australian technology to the world, it's suddenly got a lot harder because a lot of your customers might go, but hang on, the Australian government might have snuck a backdoor in here and you're not even allowed to tell us. How credible do you think that argument is?
Well, the crazy thing is it doesn't matter how credible that argument is because it's an argument that can be made. And what you're referencing, I mean, it's very funny how that all became a big part of that debate, because that actually came directly out of a Risky Business interview, which was in a sponsored interview with Sanitas. I mean, that's the way my program makes money, is at the end of the show, we get a sponsor on to talk about issues that are near and dear to their heart. And I'd had lunch in Melbourne with the CEO of a company called Sanitas that makes encryption equipment that is sold to, a lot of military networks in a lot of places. And they expressed that concern that, since the Snowden leaks, their business went really well. First of all, because their type of technology, layer 2 encryptors that work over fiber networks, became very, very popular. And also because US technology was all of a sudden on the nose, and Australia is seen as a very trustworthy place to buy this sort of stuff from. And he said, look, the AA bill doesn't target our stuff, but there is going to be a perception that it does, and we would very much like to see an exemption for defence licensed exporters. That interview blew up and wound up being cited in Senate estimates, which was a bit surreal. And also in
it's always
PJCA.
Nice to be popular.
Yeah, well, it was a bit weird, and I think I do have some sympathy for Sanitas, who counts among one of their largest clients, the Australian government, right, who I don't think expected that interview to get quite the reaction that it did. I think that's a legit concern. I don't think it's something that they can't market their way out of. Yeah. At the end of the day, this law only applies as an additional layer over the top of law that applies to people who are within the jurisdiction of the Australian courts, right? So I can't see a scenario where they would be asked to do anything to their technology. But the fact is, I mean, then you're asking, offshore buyers in countries, other than here, to actually have a nuanced understanding of Australian legislation, and that's maybe not great. So we'll have to see what Sanitas does, whether or not they continue to manufacture here or they move some of their operations overseas.
I was speaking to Sanitas not recently for an article for CRN, and it was about onshore manufacturing. And Sanitas build all of their gear in Melbourne. I want to say Mulgrave, maybe?
I think Clayton,
Clayton. And they know that they could do it cheaper in China. But they then know that a lot of their customers would question whether or not they wanted something that was made in China because of the risks.
You will never see Sanitas manufacture in China.
Exactly. But my point is that's why they stay in Australia, so they can guarantee their customers they don't have to worry about that. But if there's similar risks being introduced here, not similar, but there's still
perceived
some kind of risk,
mate.
Perceived risk, then you're right. That is definitely going to make it harder for them because suddenly that made in Australia stamp is not as attractive as it used to be.
Well, and they're anticipating that some of their competitors might try to clobber them with it, which is, would be a pretty low way to market. But hey, it's IT, right?
Yeah.
Is the marketing spiel then, don't worry, Big Brother is listening, but it's only Peter Dutton?
Oh God, Potato Man in the wires. Terrifying. Well,
that just about wraps up another episode of Vertical Hold. Thanks so much to Pat for joining us.
It was really my pleasure. It was lovely to speak to you both. It's been a long time.
Now, as always, we love to get your feedback on the show, so feel free to comment via Twitter or the Vertical Hold Facebook page.
Thanks, everyone, for listening. And remember, if you like what you hear, tell your friends, hit that subscribe button and leave us a review. Vertical Hold, Behind the Tech News, is proudly brought to you by Belkin.
I cannot add anything intelligent to that one, I'm afraid.